I talk to a lot of people who struggle to fully implement the new wonderful things they learned from continuing education. You take ranching for profit, you go to a stockmanship class, or you take a marketing course, and you come home and you struggle to fully implement what you now know. Often the barrier isn't what you know, it's your own mind. Bud Williams used to tell us to get our mind right constantly. We know a lot of the right things, but implementing them often requires a new mindset. Fred Provenza describes conquering your own mind as the longest 6 inches, the distance between your ears. Sometimes you need to unlearn a few things you think you know. In the Zone Rancher course offered through ranching.fyi, Bob Palmer teaches us how to have an elite-level mindset. Bob has spent his career working with Olympic-level athletes, the military and business people, teaching them how to work in the mental zone where they are most effective. We've all experienced the feeling of choking. Many of us know that we don't perform at our best under pressure. Many of us have also experienced the zone as a fleeting moment of brilliance when we perform at our best. Bob helps prepare us mentally for those high-stress situations where the consequences are dire and/or the stakes are high. He teaches us how to practice correctly to get our mind right. He has developed tools that allow us to consistently perform at our best in the moments when we need it the most. Life in the zone is better. It's better for your business. It's better for your family. Join the next round of Zone Rancher through www.ranching.fyi and lead yourself and those around you to a whole new level. Welcome to the Ranchonomics Podcast, where we empower you to build a better ranch and transform your operations into a thriving business. I'm your host, John Haskell. Let's get started. All right, Sarah Delavan, welcome back to the Ranchonomics Podcast. This is part 2 of a 2-part podcast. If you missed part 1, please go back and listen to our conversation from last week. I introduced Sarah there. She is the Good Food CFO. We collaborate on a number of projects and look forward to doing significantly more if she will allow that. We spent last week talking about the importance of gross margin and having that number large enough. I want to continue our discussion from last week, and I want to get into how does gross margin impact cash flow. So I'm going to give real quickly the example. I think of your gross margin is a measure of when I put $1 into the top of this business, how many dollars filter down into the business to pay for things like overhead, to service debt, to create profit, to fuel growth, to pay taxes, these sorts of things. So Sarah, starting with that model, let's talk about, maybe we want to start with a bad gross margin or how gross margin impacts cash.
Sure. So every business starts with debt, right?
Yep.
So the example you gave last week where we're borrowing $10 to buy a pair of glasses, we're going to sell that pair of glasses for $20. So we've got $20 in our hands, right? But 10 of that has to pay back the debt. And then that leaves $10 in our hands still. We need that $10 to purchase the next pair of glasses that we are going to sell. There's essentially no money there to cover any overheads, period, right? So from that $10, as you said last week, let's say we have $5 worth of overhead. All right. So from that 10, we've got $5 to cover our overheads. Now we've got $5 left to buy another pair of glasses, but that's not enough. We need 10. So we have to go borrow more debt. In this example, your gross margin is 50% because the glasses cost you $10 and you sold them for $20. And this is critical because a lot of people believe that 50% is quote unquote good and that you can build a profitable business with that. But especially in a growth phase, right? And especially when you've got overheads, you need cash in the business. You need more than 50% margin in order to operate. I think, period.
Yeah.
End of sentence, right? And so when we think about, and we talked through this in detail last week, so I won't go too deep into it, but when you think about if you don't have margins above that 50%, you're going to have to continue to borrow and borrow and borrow money to sometimes just sustain and definitely to grow the business. So if you don't want to be in that situation or you want to limit the requirement of debt, right, to operate your business, then you want to have a gross margin that is well above 50%. And I like to say for D2C, if you're selling only in that channel, a 60% margin and above is a very healthy place to be. What that is going to do is bring in enough cash from the sale of those glasses to pay back the debt that it costs you to purchase them, to buy a new one, to cover overheads. And in many cases, when you hit a certain level of, revenue and you're selling enough units, you'll have profitability in your business. And that's essentially what I think you and I are striving for every business to have.
Yeah.
The cool thing is that your gross margins are highly controllable and you can change them, to get the outcomes that you desire.
Love it. Okay. So I want to back up just one piece here, I think.
Mm-hmm.
If I am particularly CPG, but it is true in many different kinds of businesses where the business is growing, most of the time in order to fuel growth, I actually incur expenses. I incur increased expenses before I incur increased revenue. So back to our sunglasses example, if I'm going to double my sales and go from selling one pair to two pairs, my cost is going to double before my revenue doubles.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when we talk about direct-to-consumer businesses, sometimes that period is as long as a year to 18 months, which I think is a very dangerous time period. But often it's a minimum of 4 to 6 months. We don't deal with many direct-to-consumer businesses that can buy a product and have it out the door in a customer's hands and the money back into the business in less than 4 months.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It does happen, but it's not common. Is that fair?
Totally.
And especially if we're dealing with on-farm production where we are seasonally limited, right? So we're in a temperate climate, right? Our production season is, let's say it's 4 to 9 months, depending on where you're at in North America. There's some period of time that you have to cover where you have no production.
Yep.
And so that leads most of our highest performing direct-to-consumer businesses maintaining 180 days worth of inventory at any time. Someday you and I are going to talk about inventory costs because that's a whole nother thing. But in this case, if I'm going to double my sales, I double my costs first.
Yeah.
And that scares the heck out of people. And when they start to see the line of credit getting larger and larger, they get very, very nervous.
Yeah. I'll share a little bit about a seasonal retail business. So they create their own products and sell them in a retail space. It's a food product. And they also have a cafe where they're buying coffee and, producing it and selling it. The store is open for 3.5 months every year. They generate over $100,000 worth of revenue in their peak months in a little town in Maine that is highly populated in the summer. And then things go dark the rest of the year. We've built, I'm going to toot my own horn here, and the founder, but we've built a model there where they can generate enough cash in those 3.5 to 4 months of operations to sustain the rent and the overheads that they still have to pay in the dark months to then set up shop again and produce in the season. It hasn't always been that way.
Yep.
The way we made it happen was identifying the right margins for the products and for the business as a whole. So we can operate, we set a threshold of 70%. This model must sell everything at a 70% margin. It has to make sense for the consumer. So you have to go, is this sandwich worth $10? If that is not a reasonable price for the consumer, it's not going to sell. So we did a lot of menu review, right? You start looking at what do my prices have to be to hit this margin goal? And does this product make sense? Maybe we need to get rid of it. Maybe we need to transition it into something else, or maybe it does make sense the way that it is. But I love that you bring up seasonality because that has, I think, creates a bigger need or a greater need for that higher margin on your products.
Yeah. And we see that also with our stocker cattle operators that operate, for 120 days. And you have 360 days worth of expenses, but you've got to make your money in 120 days.
And what that does when you've got, I'm just going to call it a higher margin, when you're operating around 65, 70% gross margin, you're going to get a lot of cash in the bank. And that's exactly what we want to see. So we start to see that we have an abundance of cash. We hold on to a lot of that cash. We don't start spending it. We don't say, woo, we've got money in the bank. Like, what do you want to do? Right? You say, thank goodness, because I have a plan. We're closed October through April. So I need to get enough money in the bank to be able to sustain and then also get started back up again in May. And so gross margin, as I said in last week's episode, is an indicator of how much cash you will have in the business and whether or not your cash flow will be positive or negative. and the amount of debt that you're going to have to take on in your business to grow or just even to stay open in many cases, right?
Yeah.
So margin, you need it to grow. You need it to have cash, right? Anything can happen. Lots of things happen out of your control. I think especially in ranching and farming, you've got weather, you've got fire. There's so much out of your control that having cash on hand, having a savings is critically important. And not to mention the ability to pay down any debt that you have borrowed. And margin, the right margin, makes all of that possible.
Okay, so let's jump to cash because you and I have similar opinions on this. Just break it out. Give me your philosophy on cash within a business.
Yeah, I mean, I strive to get every company that I work with to 12 weeks of cash runway, if you will.
Okay.
ASAP.
Okay, 12 weeks. And what kind of turnaround times or turnover times are your businesses often looking at?
So it varies.
Yeah.
But for example, if someone's producing their own product, not working with a co-packer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Producing your own product, typically our turnaround is between, I would say, 45 and 60 days from when we're purchasing the inputs and able to turn that into revenue.
Okay, so I would say on average, yours are lower than ours. The number of days of turnaround is lower. Is that fair?
Unless you're working with a co-packer, which is very much like the meat processing process, right? You've got 50 head of cattle that you're going to process. That's a lot of product. That's a lot of upfront cost. It takes a couple of weeks to finish that process, right? Get it into your inventory, and that's going to take you potentially a little while to sell through that.
Yep.
That is very similar to a co-packer relationship where I've got a minimum, and that minimum might be 10,000 units. And I've got to buy all the inputs, pay for all the production of the storage, the inventory of that. When that happens, we are looking at anywhere from 6 months to a year of not seeing a return on that investment. So yeah, it varies.
Do you change your runway recommendation based on that? Okay.
Yep.
And give me an idea. How do you think about that? Is the runway the turnover time? Is the runway, 1.5 times that? What do you think of there?
That's a good question. I don't know if I could give it a specific answer in terms of like the number of times, but the way that I look at it is how frequently are we purchasing? So I kind of look at it as like, when are we going to have to spend money again? And what is typically the rate at which we're going to sell through that product? I need to have enough cash in the business so that when it comes time to purchase again, I have the money to do it, and that it won't be all of the money in my business such that, okay, I can buy another round of product, but then I have no money to operate my business.
Now you can't make payroll and pay the rent and all that stuff.
Right. So I kind of look at it in terms of like an actual business to business. I'm looking at the numbers and going, what do we need here? What makes sense here? And listen, if I can get 6 months, 8 months, even 12 months, you know what I mean? I will. And then we know, okay, we've got some money that we can invest in marketing or, do some things with, pay our team more, pay ourselves more. But I love a long cash runway and a big savings.
Is there an upper limit? Is there such a thing as too much cash?
I think that there
business?
is. I do think that there is.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I'm also a proponent of putting your cash in a place where it can make money. You know what I mean?
Yep. Shannon Sims, this is for you, just so in case you're listening.
I think that that's important. But yeah, I don't think that you need to be sitting on, like, for example, I have a founder who is simply afraid to spend money to the point where they weren't paying themselves. And it's like, okay, this money's going in the bank and it's there for these emergencies, and they're very frightened. And what I do in that instance is like, especially if someone is not paying the basic things and like themselves, right, and taking care of things in the business, I show them you can take out X number of dollars per month to pay yourself. It's not going to run your bank account down to zero. So I guess to answer your question, it's like, it's a case by case. But yes, I think, I don't know what that number is, but there is too much money in the bank, especially if you're not doing certain things in your business.
What percentage of businesses do you see struggle with the possibility of too much cash?
No, I think I've had like 2 in my entire 7-year experience where I've been ladies, pay yourselves. Women in particular. I mean, I work mostly with women, but they're like hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank. It's like, guys, you can pay yourself a salary. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Take $30,000 a year, you'll be fine. Yeah, very good. Okay, but let's talk about the other more frequent case, which is running short of cash. So what are the consequences there? Because I feel like I spend a lot of time talking people into keeping more cash in the business, and they're often worried that it's going to reduce their profitability. What's your experience there?
I definitely have never seen it reduce anyone's profitability. That's an interesting thought, actually. Can you tell me more about why?
So during the last couple of years of fairly high inflation and low interest rates, right, they said, well, if I'm leaving it sit in the bank, it's not working for me.
How would they make it work for them?
By buying more product to sell, that sort of.
But that's tricky because if are you selling it, right? So it's like, if you can actually turn it into cash quickly, great, right? Especially if it's got a good margin. If you're able to turn it into cash and your margin's 40%, I would say don't do that because you just lost money.
Right. You're going backwards.
Right. If you're taking it out of your savings and you're selling it on a product where you're generating 50%, you're just moving your money around. It's not actually making you any money. If you can buy product with it, sell it quickly at a good margin, okay. You know what I mean? If it's going to sit in inventory, absolutely not. I would rather have actually liquid, right?
Yeah.
Assets as opposed to assets in the freezer, for example.
Okay, so let's get back to this cash thing. I think about it in some cases, at a minimum, I think of cash at a certain level as insurance.
Absolutely.
So I keep a certain amount of money in my checking account for the same reason I pay for my car insurance. I have no intention of using it, but if I have an accident, it's there if I need it. Do you see cases where people get short on cash and then have to lower their margins even more to then be able to continue forward to the next round of bills?
No, I wouldn't advise on that. There are limited situations where someone is so desperate for cash and does need it that we would run a sale, like a very short-term sale, just to get cash in the door. But I know the longer-term effects of that. And by long-term, I mean 2-3 weeks down the road. You know what I mean? It's not good. I don't like the idea of doing something for a short-term win that is going to be more detrimental in the future financially. So that wouldn't be something that I would typically recommend that we do. Honestly, I think about how can we borrow money in the least expensive way and fix what's broken in the business so that we stop running short on cash. Or, John, and you and I have talked about lots of different companies and what goes on in companies. Sometimes you need to, for example, stop selling, slow down growth, right? Change the product mix. Like, there's more strategic things that you can do, like actually with the business and the business model, that I think have a positive impact on cash. I'm not opposed to borrowing money. I like to do it as cheaply as possible, knowing that we've made modifications and we'll be able to generate the cash necessary to pay back that debt and be in a good cash situation. And that's a lot of information. I understand that, but those are my thoughts on sort of what do you do when someone is running out of cash? You know what I mean? There's been no shortage of times where I've been managing people's money week to week while changing the business model. And when I tell you, when you get it right, and I've shared with you, I had a client where we changed the business model and we went from running week to week in terms of cash very quickly to a 12-week cash runway, very quickly to profitability on the P&L. And it's like night and day for that founder and for my work, because it's easy to manage their cash now.
Blood pressure goes down massively,
incredibly,
right?
yeah.
I mean, when you're in the week to week deal, it's touch and go. Okay, so let's quickly on debt. You're not opposed to debt.
Mm-mm.
I worry sometimes, especially in low margin companies, that debt can be used to mask problems. So I think you're very specific about how you use debt and what you're doing while you are increasing indebtedness. Let's give us some stuff there.
I think that debt is a privilege. Not everyone has access to debt, and it absolutely can be utilized as a tool or leveraged as a tool, A, to start a business, right? And B, to, in some instances, sort of turn the business around. I wouldn't utilize debt. My philosophy is not to utilize debt in a low margin business, because that is a game that is very, very, very hard to win.
Yep. You're just making it even harder to pay
Exactly.
back. Okay. But as you mentioned before, if you have to borrow money while you are revamping, then that's a stopgap, if you will, helps you get to the next phase. But you are very intentional about the fact that you are getting to the next phase.
I think the conversation has to happen. Okay, you're borrowing this debt. What is the purpose? And what are we doing to change this so that we don't find ourselves in that same situation? So yeah, it's very kind of like specific as to when I would recommend someone take on.
Okay, good. One last thing I want to ask you about before we wrap up. You mentioned earlier that your margins are under your control. Yep. I'd like you to talk a little more about that. So when you say that, that means you can change it. You can make your margins higher. Help me.
There's a couple different ways you can do it. A lot of people, their brains will go right to the cost of the product. That's not always completely in your control, but to some degree it may be.
So maybe we negotiate a better deal. Maybe we get a little lower freight. Maybe we can.
Yep.
Okay. But I would add to that always that I am very wary if it requires some sort of bulk commitment, right? Because if we're also focused on cash, then, going to Costco is in fact cheaper. But if I spend 10 times as much, it's a different thing. Okay, good. All right. Keep going.
That's okay. So the other things is obviously your price point, right? So you have to know your consumer. You have to know if your product is positioned correctly in the market that you're in to sell at what I'm going to call a premium, right? Or if you're able to increase your price, because with an increase in price, if your costs stay the same, you have an automatic increase in margin.
And it's literally dollar for dollar. For every dollar I add to my top line revenue, if I keep the costs the same, I have a new dollar in gross profit, right? Which means that both the dollars goes up and the percentage goes up. And in most of our businesses, that is a direct dollar to the bottom line.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. So the other thing is what we call, and I don't know if this is a term that you use in ranching very widely, but it's channel strategy. So who am I selling to and how? Even if we just think about D to C alone, am I selling at farmers markets? Am I selling on my ranch? Am I selling on a website in which I have to ship product, maybe frozen to somebody? Understanding what are my margins all in those channels. Can I increase my sales in, let's say, my on ranch, channel, or can I increase it in my farmer's market channel because my margins are greater there? If as a business, I'm selling more product in those channels, then my product margins don't change, but my overall gross margins for my business do change. And so those are just a short list of ways that you can think about it. The other thing is product mix. Am I utilizing, in your case, an animal in the best possible way to get the most amount of revenue and margin from it? We do the same thing with product. Am I selling it at the right size? Am I selling the right products? You know what I mean? Is there one here that's too low of a margin and maybe I should get rid of it, or I should bundle it and always sell it with something that's high margin? You can think through and strategize those things and have a positive impact on your margin.
Love it. And price for most owners, I find, is a terrifying conversation, right? What's the thing that most owners want to do least, which is, increase their price. At the same time, it seems to me that most of our direct to consumer businesses provide an incredibly high price product that they insist on comparing back to a Walmart or Albertsons price point. And I deal with people all the time who you don't compete with them. Like, you don't sell the same product. Your hamburger may kind of look like theirs, but it's a totally different product and therefore should have a totally different price.
Yeah. I'll give a similar example. It's like I work with a nut company and their nuts are nothing like the Planters nuts, right, that are sold at the grocery store.
Right.
So they shouldn't sell in a grocery store, number one, right? Not the right market. So where do you go and sell? Where does your customer live? Who is the person who understands the value of your product? In finance, when we talk about pricing and COGS and things like that, you cannot do it in a vacuum. You have to consider who your customer is, where they are, and all of those elements to make it all work together.
Yep. And over again, I see that people will spend $1,000 on a cell phone. And it's like, where do they come up with that money? Well, you know what? They come up with it because they want a cell phone.
And I think with food, there's a certain level of I was going to say values. And I think that that's sort of part of it, right? I think some people in the better for you food space or the direct from farm and ranch space, their value is that they want to support someone in their community. Their value is that they want that direct connection to where their food is coming from. Then there's going to be like your health market, right? Where like someone like me, my introduction to it was like, I'm in a painful situation that I want to change. And this doctor just told me that if I change the way that I eat, it's going to be better. I try it. It works. I'm committed. I'm so committed that I'm going to go and work in that industry. That's how committed I am, right? So yeah, who are your people? How are they finding you? And listen, we will pay the money for the food, but you got to find us.
Very good. Sarah, this is awesome. Thank you so much. I would like to have you back. It may have to be a little while, but again, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can learn about our podcast and some of the tools and resources that we provide at thegoodfoodcfo.com. You can listen to the podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts and also on YouTube. Some folks like that. On Instagram at thegoodfoodcfo and Sarah Delavan on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And I will give a plug for your podcast. It is absolutely one of my favorites. I listen to it every week and look forward to hearing more from you. So Sarah, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for tuning into the Ranchnomics podcast. We hope this episode helped you win today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend.